Hello, friends. This is Chad Wakefield, the Chief Champion of You. I am the founder and president of Revival Development Services. We're a management consultancy in the community development space, and we do a lot of things. One of our passions is relocation, planning, implementation, and sometimes just coaching for our clients. Wanted to do a short recording today for you that I'm calling Issues and Challenges in Relocation. This is a snapshot of something I did with a few friends of mine from Foothills Regional Housing, which is a Colorado rebranded housing authority. They've been doing quite a number of trainings of late with the Colorado Housing Finance Agency, and invited me on the other day to join them and talk a little bit of relocation. We had some technical difficulties, so I wanted to do this as a recording, get it out there so folks got the benefit of it, and hopefully can learn a little bit from me. So thanks for watching in advance. There's a nice picture of me, and that's not me in front of a successful relocation. That's actually me in front of the Purple Rain House in Minneapolis. One of the enjoyable things about my work is I do get to travel around a bit, different parts of the country, and while I'm there, I like to see things that are interesting to me. I'm a big Prince fan and took advantage of being out there. So just a little bit of way to shed some light on my personality, I hope as well. I like doing this work, and hopefully I'm a fun guy, and people like to work with me. So what's relocation? Well, today what we're going to talk about is relocation in the realm of federally funded projects or other publicly funded projects. A lot of our work involves renovation or redevelopment of existing housing for the creation or preservation of affordable housing, or other kinds of community development projects, redeveloping blighted areas, just bringing new life back into places, and that at times causes the displacement of folks or the need to relocate folks. And so many of our clients are doing relocation of residents or owners of businesses as a result of acquiring property, redeveloping it, doing an in-place renovation on an apartment building or a higher density residential area. Usually with in-place renovation, what you're talking about is doing work in kitchens and bathrooms with folks not having to be away from their homes, but for certain appointed times a day. And then there's minor or major rehabilitation of multifamily housing in, like I said, higher density areas. Other reasons, residential owner-occupied, touched on business and nonprofit organizations. Sometimes it's stuff, personal property. An example that I use is I worked with a public housing authority many years ago who was redeveloping a site in San Francisco, and they had a small business who was just storing landscape equipment in a shed, and so their shed had to be moved for the project, and so we helped figure out how much it was going to cost them and helped got them paid. The good news is they got to come back. They were a small business that the housing authority frequently used, and although they didn't operate their business solely from that site, they did store things, and so that's what necessitated helping them out with the payment. A couple mistakes and common misconceptions that I've noticed I'm now into my second decade of doing this work, and a couple of things have come up routinely, and so I've turned them into a little bit of a top 10 list. The general information is the 90-day notice, and that's not accurate. The general information notice is a required notice under the Federal Uniform Act, and it's the first notice that a displacee or somebody that's going to have to relocate would get. It advises them that a project is being planned that may require them to move, whether it's temporarily or it's permanently. And this is a notice that is it's given on the very front end of projects. It's given before funding applications are submitted. It's given at the around the same time that offers are made to acquire property. Those kinds of milestone timings. For housing projects, it more than often is happening before an application for, say, home or community development block grants are submitted to state, local agency that's sort of shepherding those funds being distributed on behalf of HUD. So it is not a 90-day notice to vacate. It's not a notice to relocate. The 90-day notice is a very specific time frame for which people have to move, and that is done when it's time, when the project is ready to move forward, and now there's a requirement for somebody to move, and the date is known, it's certain. So these are not the same thing. And there's not a 90-day trigger for the GIN. I think that's where the confusion comes in, is that folks, they confuse the processes. So in some cases, the GIN may be served a year, 2 years in advance, whereas the 90-day notice is served 3 months before somebody needs to move. Persons are only on a month-to-month lease. The Uniform Act doesn't really care about the term of the lease that somebody is under. And yes, and especially with residential occupants, there are a lot of folks that are on month-to-month leases. Even a lot of businesses are on month-to-month leases. The term of the notice does not matter as far as somebody's eligibility. It doesn't have a bearing. It may have a bearing if there's some kind of compensation that's given for the remaining term of that lease, but that has nothing to do with somebody's ability to claim residential relocation payment or a business. There's not a requirement that somebody has to be a long-term tenant in the Uniform Act, aside from people do have to be there 90 days prior to the initiation of negotiations. That's the trigger. But month-to-month leases has nothing to do with that. Somebody's not paid rent in a year. Have had cases where people are delinquent in rent. And at the point in time that relocation activity is started, some developers want to then, or owners, want to exercise their right as a landlord to go through an eviction process. And that's the wrong timing. They've let it go for far too long, and it's just simply too late. They need to they need to have taken sooner action than that. And you can't take back rent out of relocation payments. So whether or not somebody's paid rent a year or not has no bearing on whether or not they are eligible for relocation assistance. If you have not filed and been successful in a relocation, or an eviction action, you still have the obligation to pay relocation benefits. If we talk to the tenants, they will know what is going on. Well, by law, you're required to inform them what's going on. By practice, you want them to know what's going on. You want them to be involved. You want them to work with you. And it's much easier for folks to work with you if they know what's going on. They know that you're interested in them and care about them. And so the more you communicate with them and involve them and advise them what is happening, the better this process is going to be. In fact, the law is really kind of predicated on communication to people. So in essence, if you're not communicating with people properly, then you're not working within the requirements of the law. And you're certainly not working within the spirit of it. Our property manager can do it. A lot of times, especially with renovation projects, developer, housing authority they'll sort of make relocation the third job of somebody in-house, and a lot of times it's the property management staff. They assume that they've got the relationship with tenants. They know, at least they know some related processes, and so they should be able to handle it. They're used to serving legal notices. They're used to keeping records, good documentation, those kinds of things. The challenge, though, is oftentimes the property management staff does not have the time. And doing relocation under the Federal Uniform Act or other guidelines is not the same thing as managing a property. It's a totally different process. It's even a different skill set. And so this is an error, and often a misstep that causes a lot of time and money because things have to be redone. Things get missed in the process. So think long and hard before you bestow the title of relocation specialist on your property manager. We only have businesses. People assume that businesses don't get assistance under the URA. Well, that's totally wrong. There's a massive section of the URA that's devoted to taking care of displaced businesses. And the process, the types of expenses that businesses get compensated for when they're displaced is totally different than residential. And this is certainly an area that if you don't really understand the URA at all, and you have a business that's going to be displaced, you really need to get some help, because you could really have some costly errors. You could either overcompensate, or you could dramatically undercompensate and end up in an appeal. So get some help, but for sure, get some help with businesses. Relocation is like an eviction. I recently saw a story out of California that was posted up on LinkedIn, and the issue was relocation activities happening for a project, and some tenants' rights groups were saying, you can't evict us, can't do that, and they weren't being evicted. They were going through a relocation process, which is not the same as an eviction. I'm not an attorney, so by the way, seek legal advice where you need it. But a layman's way to look at it, an eviction is a court-ordered process. You file suit against somebody, you go to court, a judge rules, and so the outcome of that is a court order for the parties to take the next steps. Somebody's moving out. There's some settlement, some restitution that's made. That's not the same thing as doing relocation, and I hear it come out of people's mouths that, well, we got to serve the eviction notices tomorrow, when what they're doing is they're redeveloping a property, there's federal funds involved, and they owe people relocation assistance. So relocation and eviction are not the same thing at all. They really are just two different things, and should not be confused. We don't need to do interviews. That kind of relates back to number 4. For some reason, people think there's danger in sitting down with folks and talking to them and collecting information from them. They also get confused that, well, we've talked to them a lot. They know what's going on, or we had a bunch of big meetings, and, well, we don't need to sit down with people individually. Well, you do. It is a requirement. It's also just good practice. Get with people one-on-one. Make sure you understand what's going on with them and what they need. The process will benefit them more, it will help you more, and you will actually do it right. Relocation is just notices. It's just giving people documents and paper. No, you actually have to explain. You have to give real advisory services. And notices are part of that, advising people in writing about what's going on, but you still have to explain it. You still have to do the work of building trust and rapport with people and doing it very well so that things do go well. So it's not just a game of papering people's front doors with a bunch of notices. It's a lot more than that. It's all about money. That is true that relocation comes with expense. People have costs related to moving that they're to be reimbursed for. They may have costs related to increased housing costs that they need to be reimbursed for. But it isn't just a program that's about throwing money at somebody and saying we're done. Again, you do have to spend time with people. You have to properly advise them. So 9 and 10 here, you definitely have to give notification and you definitely have to provide compensation for folks, but it isn't just about either 9 or 10. It's about both of them, and it's about even more than that. It really is about building trust and building understanding and taking care of folks' needs through this process. It's a difficult process. Put yourself in their shoes. If somebody was to show up at your front door and say, hey, you got to leave in 90 days. How would you feel if they just told you that and they walked away? Probably not very good. You'd be unhappy. Depending on your personality, you may want to take things a step further and appeal, seek some remedies through the courts. So don't just handle it that way. Treat people humanely. I think one of the best statements I ever heard was from a HUD relocation specialist. He says, treat folks like your grandma. To me, that means listen to them, treat them with respect, explain things where you need to, and help them out. But trust their life experience to help you help them, and don't sugarcoat things. Be clear and honest about things. They're smart folks and they can handle it. So don't shortchange people. Spend the time and do this right. I like to say that successful relocation is 3 R's. So R3 equals successful relocation: required, reasonable, and right. You have to do what's required. That's the notifications, that's following the law, that's providing the right amount of compensation. You can't get away from doing that. That's a requirement of you. However, to do this right, you have to apply a reasonable amount of effort. You have to apply a reasonable amount of research. You have to figure out what's going to work for the folks that you're working with. No two people are the same. Yes, you're trying to be efficient with your time, but you also have to figure out how do we best suit the needs of folks in this process. And so you have to figure out what's going on with them. The other thing is that the law doesn't just give you a playbook. There's no start to finish process. There's timelines, there's expenses, there's kind of a checklist of what you want to do if you interpret the law that way. But there is no playbook that's handed to you. You've got to figure out how to reasonably implement that law for your project and for the folks that you're working with. If you do those things, if you add up required and reasonable, you're going to be right as in correct. The one thing I tell people, though, is you're probably always going to have to explain or defend the reasonable, because it is how you're applying the gray areas of the law. It's how you're applying the law to your specific needs. So as long as you're meeting the minimum standards, the requirements, meeting spec, if you're applying a reasonable approach to the area that you're in, to the folks that you're working with, you're going to be right. People have viewed that you did this as well as you could have. It's like anything else. There's bound to be critics. There's bound to be folks that aren't totally happy. But if you've applied a reasonable approach and tried to figure things out based on the specifics, you're probably going to be right in this. A quick and dirty process. People often ask, when should we get started on certain things? The thing I try to coach people on is break relocation down into a real process, right? And look at it as you got to plan it, you got to do it, you got to close things out, and along the way you need to monitor yourself and control issues that come up. And control your quality and your delivery. Quality means meeting spec. So whatever program you committed to, that's your spec. That's the quality that you need to meet. And so the way you do that is you monitor and control it. Quality assurance, quality control. Planning, for me at least, needs to start at least 180 days from actual relocations. You got to give yourself some time on the front end to engage folks. May need to bring some outside help. Get your general notices out, meet with folks, interview, spend time to do real thorough cost estimating and scheduling. Right? My friends from Foothills had a great comment. They said, no fake budgets. Well, that applies to relocation as well. No fake budgets and no fake schedules. you want to have realistic timelines, and you want to have a very thorough cost estimate. You've got to think through what people need, what's required under the law, but also what you're going to actually have to do to get things done and do them well. What in your situation are you going to have to do that's not written in the law? And all that's got to go into your cost estimate. And it's better to figure this out at least 6 months in advance, or start to figure it out. I mean, you may be updating things, but you got to really put time in up front to really plan. And I think in most cases, it's not going to be a very well-planned project if you don't start at least 6 months in advance from when you need to start working with folks to get them moved. Execution, now you're moving into that phase where you're really doing the work to get folks moved. And if you're doing a permanent relocation, to me, that's going to take you a minimum of 120 days, because you're going to have to give people 90 days under the notice. They may move sooner than 90 days, but you have to give them 90 days to execute their move. I think you need 30 days in advance of that 90-day clock to start. You may need to sit back down with folks and verify information. You certainly need to verify your schedule and make sure you're not going at this too early. Give yourself some time to prepare eligibility documents, collect additional documentation that you need. Give yourself 30 days. So, work backwards from, let's say you're going to demolish a building. You're going to redevelop your site. You're going to demolish a building. Use the date that you need to start doing invasive testing, or the start date of a permit as a benchmark to work backwards from. Go back 4 months from that date. That's when you should start executing your relocation. Make sure you've got enough time. Don't just assume that people are going to move early. Assume that everybody's going to take all 90 days, and assume that you're going to need 30 days to get ready for that process. Closing. The great movie Glenn Ross always talks about always be closing. Well, in our case during relocation, always be closing means, keep your files up to date. Always be preparing for an auditor's review. Always make sure you've got notification signed, claim signed, whatever it is. So always keep the end in mind that you're going to close this project out someday. And it's easier to close things in small pieces as you go along than it is to wait until the very end, or worse, years after you're done, and everybody involved in the project's gone off and done other things. They may not even be part of your organization. So a successful close actually starts at the beginning. And like I said, monitor yourself along the way. Assume that you're going to get audited, and so have somebody that's keeping track of what's going on. That's why it's important to figure out your staffing. You really need a responsible project manager that's going to monitor all three of these activities, and make sure that the plan is being followed, that the work you're doing follows the plan. If it's not, then you got to tweak the plan. You got to update it. Things do change in projects, so you need to update your project plans periodically. Relocation is a project, so don't think of it any differently than you would construction, or maybe some kind of IT project that your organization does. It's the same thing. It's a project that's important to your organization, so treat it like that, and have somebody that is tasked, a real project manager that's tasked to monitoring and controlling this relocation process. 3 things to remember always about relocation. I mentioned this earlier. Treat folks like your grandma, right? Courtesy, respect, and care. That will go a long way. It'll save you a lot of conflict and a lot of headache. Understand what you have to do, right? You gotta really get in up front on this stuff and figure out your cost. Figure out your schedules. Figure out how the relocation is going to tie in with construction or demolition or whatever it is. You got to do a lot of thinking on the front end. More often than not, even though people know they have to do this, they wait until the very end. Sometimes they wait until after they've got money in hand to do a project and those budgets are already baked, and then they figure out the relocation cost. At that point, you're too late, because the relocation is going to cost you a lot more. If you've waited that long, relocation is probably going to cost you a hell of a lot more than you've budgeted. Many years ago, I had a client that had a 300-unit building that was going to be renovated. They had a relocation budget for $5,000. $5,000 to move every one of those 300 folks temporarily. That meant the cost of hotels, movers, everything, staffing. And they devoted $5,000 in their budget to it. Their budget was close to $1 million. So their budget was blown all to hell. I don't know how it tore out. I mean, the project got done, the building got renovated, but financially, I don't know where they stood. That's an extreme example, but it's, those are the best to learn from sometimes. And again, treat relocation like a project. Right? Employ some basic project management skill to this. Develop a scope, develop a schedule, develop a budget, develop a communications plan, figure out who your stakeholders are, and figure out what you're going to have to do on a quality management side. Again, quality means meeting spec. Whatever you agree to, whatever your stakeholders demand, whatever your funding partners require, those are your specifications for your project, and they flow down into relocation. You have to plan for that, and you have to plan for how you're going to oversee it, monitor, and control it. Right? That's basic project management. So if nothing else, apply a basic project management understanding to relocation. Even if you don't do so well on the human side and spend the kind of time, at least treat it like a project, things are going to go much better for you. I promise. But I also encourage you, be a real human being on this stuff. Imagine it's you, or imagine it's a family member. What would you want to know? How far in advance would you want to know it? How would you want to be communicated with? How would you not want to be communicated? All those things are important. And if you roll that into these three things, I think you're going to be okay in most cases. So questions to ask yourself to figure out if you're going to need some help. Determine, have we ever done this? If you answered no, you need to get some help. Do we have staff to devote to treating relocation like a project versus part of their day-to-day or their functional role? i.e. using your property management staff because, well, they got some time. If the answer is you don't have staff to devote full-time or at least a significant part of their time to relocation, then you need to get some help. You need to at least get somebody to look at your staffing and figure out, can you distribute the work well enough to make sure that it goes right? Do we know how to evaluate all issues, including contingencies and unintended consequences? If the answer is no, get some help. If you don't have people sitting around the table that can think about what could go wrong, then you need to get some help. And the one thing I will say is, people can come up with a million reasons why things are not going to go well, and use it as a reason to not do it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about thinking through some of the basic risks, some of the things that happen a lot on these projects. Construction delays is one, funding delays, having a really rosy schedule that says, well, we're going to get everything approved on this date. So yeah, we got a couple months before we're going to deliver this project to get everybody moved. If any one of those things slip, now you've taken time, and the time that you can't take away is the amount of time that you give people under a notice to move. Don't use their time as a way to make up for your mistakes. Right? So if you can't think through those contingencies, you really got to get some help. Have we ever done this before and gotten our hands slapped? If the answer is yes, get some help. At least bring in a third party to do a good, thorough relocation plan for you. And then maybe help them monitor you or take a look at what you're doing a couple times. That's a good solution. Are there certain things we know we can do, but we haven't done them in a while? Right? So if the answer is yes, get some help. And if you've never done it, get some help. Have you ever used the source of funding that you're considering? I have current clients now that are using home and CDBG money, which is HUD sources. They're going to demolish buildings. They're going to demolish and remove low-income occupied units, and their relocation plan is totally inadequate because they don't consider that not only is the Federal Uniform Act, there's Section 104D, so they're using a source of money that they're very unfamiliar with, and there's got a lot more rules and layers than they're aware of. And they're fairly late in the game. And so the implications of that have not been fully weighted and baked into the pie. So they needed some help and they got it. If that's you, then get some help. And if you're just not sure, you're like, well, we think we know what this is, but does it look the same as the other stuff? Get some outside help. Get somebody to look at it and give you an opinion. And if you need some help, if you're seeing this before March 23rd, then there's a couple of help. CHFA is Colorado Housing Finance Authority. Go on their website. I've got 3 webinars coming up with them, and then there's my contact. HUD's got a good self-paced class called URA, the HUD way. It's very good. It's about 7 modules, I think. And it's good stuff. It's good information. They ask some pretty interesting questions in their Q&A that makes up their test. So a couple sources, and certainly I'm here to help you. So phone number and emails there. I'd be glad to talk to you. Rather spend a few minutes on the phone with you and save you a world of headache than to see a project go badly. I don't want to read about you in the news for bad stuff. I want to read about your successes or see your successes up on LinkedIn. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. By all means, reach out to me if I can help. Have a great night.